Hey everyone! Today we're going to be replacing the rear brake rotors and pads on the 2004 Infiniti G35X. Stay tuned. I was visiting my relative one day when I heard a loud grinding noise while she was parking her car. We took the G35 for a spin around the block, and I could distinctly hear the noise coming from the rear of the car. On closer examination of the rear brakes, I could see the pads were low, but what I could not see is what we'll find later in this video. To get started, I jacked up the rear of the car. If you're unsure of how to jack up the rear of the G35, check out the video that I made on that subject. We're going to be doing the passenger side here, so I removed the passenger side rear wheel using a 21mm deep socket. Next, I started to remove the lower slide pin using a 14mm ratcheting wrench. Then I remembered from past experience working on an Altima that the rear wheel needs to be jacked up so the slide pin can clear the bar. With the lower pin out, I swung the brake caliper up. Then I used a bungee to hold it open. I then removed the brake pads. When I looked at the rotors on this car at my relative's house, I was pretty confident that just the brake pads needed to be replaced on this car. But as you can see here, the inner pads material was worn down to the metal, most likely meaning that the backside of the rotor was damaged also. So I guess it's time to remove the rotor and take a closer look at it. So I removed the two caliper bracket bolts with a 17mm ratcheting wrench. Since the parking brake shoes push against the inside of the rotor, I had to disengage the parking brake so I could remove the rotor. And the moment of truth. Yep, this rotor's done. It was late in the day, so I headed down the street to the local AutoZone to buy a Duralast Gold rotor. While I had the rotor off the car, I examined the emergency brake shoes for wear using a digital caliper. They were still within spec at about 2.2 millimeters of material. The limit is 1.5 millimeters. So I just decided to hit the parts with some brake parts cleaner before installing the new rotor. I also cleaned the wheel hub with a wire brush. The Duralast Gold rotor has a coating on the outside, so I didn't need to use brake cleaner to clean off the oily preservative that's normally included with steel rotors. So I just slid the new rotor onto the wheel hub, and at this point you may want to install a couple lug nuts to hold the rotor in place. I didn't actually do that here. Next, I cleaned the caliper bracket bolts with a wire brush, then I reinstalled the caliper over the rotor. I decided to use some anti-seize on the caliper bracket bolts since they were a little difficult to remove earlier. I took a second while I had the caliper open to hit it with some brake parts cleaner. To finish off the brake caliper bolt installation, I tightened them with a torque wrench and a 17mm socket. The torque spec is 53 to 71 foot-pounds. Before installing the brake pads, I clean the thin metal pad retainers with a wire brush. If your retainers have rust or other damage, they should be replaced. Okay, we're ready to install the brake pads. I'll be installing Akebono Act 905 Pro Act Ultra Premium ceramic pads that come with shims. I've grown accustomed to using 3M silicone paste on the pad ears, but brake grease can also be used. A small packet of brake grease should have been included with the brake pads. And as you'll see later, it's advisable to use silicone on any parts that touch rubber to prevent swelling. If 2 of the 4 pads in the set came with built-in metal wear indicators, a pad with a wear indicator goes on the interior side of the rotor on each rear wheel. To close the caliper over the brake shoes, I'm going to retract the piston using a brake pad spreader and an old brake pad. At this point, you're going to want to make sure you monitor the brake fluid in the reservoir under the hood so it doesn't overflow. And a turkey baster may come in handy to suck up some of the fluid if it's necessary. Okay, I'm going to install the lower slide pin. So what I'll do first is wipe it off, then I'll apply some 3M silicone paste and install it onto the caliper. I'll do the same thing to the upper pin. Before I close up the caliper, I'm going to apply some silicone paste to the surfaces of the caliper that contact the back of the brake pads. To finish off the caliper installation, I'm going to tighten the slide pins with a torque wrench and a 14mm socket. The torque spec here is 28 to 36 foot-pounds. Then I'll lower the wheel and get the jack out of the way. Put the wheel back on with the lug nuts decently tight. And with the car on the ground, I'll tighten the lug nuts to 72 to 87 foot-pounds. The last thing to mention here is to slowly pump the brake pedal to seat the brake pads before driving your car. And that's it.